Welcome, everybody. It's time to get started here. I'm Bob Leverich. I'm teaching with Julia Heineccius in Thinking Through Craft, and Julia's speaking this morning, and one of our students, Zoe Hensley, is going to introduce her to you.
Hi, everybody. Happy week 10. I think there's a cold around. I apologize for my voice. So today we have the pleasure of hearing from Julia Heineccius. She is currently a visiting faculty member at the Evergreen State College. She's teaching a year-long program called Thinking Through Craft, which I'm a member of. And she'll be returning next fall to teach studio projects, Seen and Unseen, with Amjad Fowler. She currently lives and works in Seattle. She was the spring 2014 Collins Foundation Artist in Residence, at the Oregon College of Arts and Craft in Portland, Oregon. And in 2015, was the visiting adjunct professor also at OCAC, teaching in the Metalsmithing department. She received her BFA from the University of Washington in 2006, and her MFA from Cranbrook Academy of Arts under Iris Eichenberg, in 2012. And she is a current member of Soil Gallery in Seattle since 2013. Her show, entitled Current Maximum, can be seen at the Feast Art Center in Tacoma until this Friday, March 11th, and the closing reception is from 7 until 9. Julia works primarily with fine metals. She plays with value of disposable and manufactured objects through labor and material. Julia's practice of art making is one of collecting and accumulation. She says, "No thing is just a thing. A vessel is a mirror and a gong. A chair is also a ladder and a basket. They started out as beautiful objects hanging around in my studio. They were just waiting for a good day to collide." Julia pays particular attention to the imperfect and the undone, using the tension of the mechanically crafted and the highly crafted to represent objects which are often repeated and reproduced. Her work is playful in that she tests and retests her assumption of how material works, while testing the audience by using value and form to mirror our own susceptibility to habit. She often describes her process as a state of change, exploring how once we are exposed to ideas, they come back and around. Julia says, rather than coming to a stop, I walk backward and look for where repetition can be revolution. So, Julia.
Thank you, Zoe Milan Hensley. That was such a good introduction. Now all I have to do is show pictures. So, I, too, am just recovering from a bout of laryngitis, which I think is pretty funny, considering it's the week that I need my voice, even more than normal. I think my students will attest to the fact that I'm usually quite loud, but I suppose you have to lose your voice in order to find your voice again. Little art metaphor for you. Before I get too flustered, I want to thank some people up front. Zoe for the introduction, Shah for inviting me to finish up what's been a really incredible winter and fall lecture series. So many of the lectures that I've attended here were incredibly inspiring and reframed the work that I do in so many ways. I'd also like to, looking at my notes. I'd like to thank Bob Leverich for mimicking his medium, being a rock. Jean Mandelberg and Joel Green for their hospitality. Michelle Pope, Don Jensen, Sarah Robinson. And then my notes cut off there. No, they don't. Bob Woods, Evan Blackwell, Lisa Sweet, Nancy Murray, and a lot of the other people in the Evergreen community that have been incredibly welcoming and helpful, and the TTC crew, Thinking Through Craft. You guys have been an incredible gift. You're a really great group, and I hope you know that before it's too late. Okay, so now begin. So I'm going to show you quite a few slides. The way that I've arranged them, I basically took previous presentations that I've done and reversed everything. So I'm going to have the sensation of going backwards a little bit, backwards and then forwards, and you won't know it, but you may have that sensation of a little bit of discombobulation as well. So we'll all just kind of get a little bit lost in parts together. I think giving a presentation is so much like being a good storyteller, and only one of the things that I inherited from my family, as you'll see a few things later, is the art of the long-winded and convoluted story. So this is how you pronounce my name. It's already been pronounced lovely several times. So, okay. So I initially have always thought that your sort of credibility was somewhat implicated by how far you came to travel, to talk, right? So if you come from across the country, you must really know what you're talking about. If you come from 60 miles away, then you must know a little bit, but maybe not quite so much. I do live in Seattle, and I do work in Seattle, but I'm also increasingly in Olympia more, and I have lived in Olympia previously through a funny set of circumstances. So the commuting comes up. It's kind of a good conversation topic, just like the weather. The drive from here to Seattle, it's not so bad. It actually takes about the same time as this lecture. So this lecture is almost like us having a commuting conversation. So I'll talk for a great deal of time up front, like I do in the car. And then when I get exhausted and start nodding off, you all can have a word in edgewise. Okay, so back to that concept of being far away. I actually think that the further away you travel, the less of an expert you become. And as Zoe brought up so nicely, I've been thinking a lot about the idea of how we travel both in physical space and visit areas that are unknown to us and that make us feel alone in the best of ways, and then also the ways that we travel through our work, through time, and kind of cycle back again and again. I have this idea that walking backwards is the best predictor of the future. I don't think it's a new idea, because I bet if I walked backwards in the future, I would find that someone else had that idea as well. In preparing for this talk, I couldn't help but be super hyper-conscious that I was going to be filmed. This is my first time being filmed, so hi, YouTube. And it got me thinking about this feeling of being watched, and how in various jobs that I've held, and also times that I have been making in the studio, I have either been watched, by an employer, or I have been, or I have orchestrated ways in which I would be watched, like in a performance, such that it would sort of heighten the experience of making, or the experience of sort of what I was doing and where my body was. So it kind of creates an artificial experience for me, and a power dynamic. And I think especially because there have been so many amazing lectures this quarter on prisons in coincidence with the exhibition that recently closed. It got me thinking about the first time I heard about the panopticon. So I'm assuming that a lot of you guys know about the panopticon, both as a concept and as an actual construct. It's something that the philosopher Foucault talks about in his Discipline and Punish book, which I was first exposed to when I was in undergrad at the University of Washington. I took a class called Brainwashing. I think at the University of Washington, a lot of the classes I took, I didn't know it, but I wanted to be at Evergreen. So I took this class called Brainwashing, and they discussed the panopticon, which I guess I'll sort of sum up as a structure, a work of architecture, where there are rooms facing a center. The center you cannot see in, but you assume that there is someone watching all of the rooms on the exterior. So you are always conscious that someone might be watching you, even if that's not actually true, and it thus affects your behavior. And this, Foucault talks about how it's not an imaginary structure. It's a physical structure that is like the ideal manifestation of power. And so I've been thinking about that a lot, just kind of as an aside, but then also that there's this difference between the quality of having the choice to expose yourself and forced exposure as a measure of control. And in the Thinking Through Craft program, we've also been talking about how systems of objects can begin to have an ability to affect or control and have power on their own. As I'm sort of traveling backwards and forwards at the same time. So this idea, came to me, I don't know, 12 or 14 years ago. And, but it keeps coming back. I keep revisiting it. And I did, in particular, when I was searching of images of the area in which I went to grad school. So I found it rather striking that this image is so similar to this image. Both are pretty grainy, but this is a prison. I'm not certain where. This is the mall nearest to Cranbrook Academy of Art. Cranbrook is about 30 minutes north of Detroit. And it's situated in one of the wealthiest zip codes in the United States, Bloomfield Hills. And so this mall, I think, although I wouldn't say I was directly affected, or I don't pull my themes sort of from this dichotomy between Detroit and, wealthy suburbia, it definitely sunk into my assessment of how value is assessed through surface, and through these images, in particular, how structure or form can kind of implicate value and power. So, a little plug for Detroit. It's an amazing city. And I think anybody who has spent any time there, which I won't say that I've actually spent quality time with Detroit, I mostly went there for grad school and then came back to the Northwest. But when we would travel into Detroit, there are incredible things happening there. And I highly recommend a visit. And anybody who's been there will kind of, you'll get their hackles up if you say not nice things about Detroit. So one of the artists that I especially appreciated from my time there is a man named Tyree Guyton. He has transformed an entire neighborhood that he lived in when he was growing up into an art installation. There's a lot of things happening recently in Detroit, people taking houses and turning them into installations. But at least as far as I'm concerned, Tyree was probably the first one to begin doing this. I believe this is one of the first pieces that he began, and then it's changed a lot over its lifetime, and it's still there. He retitled it recently the New White House. It used to be called the Dottie Waddy House. And the area, if you are there and you want to go visit, is called the Heidelberg Project. So this is the great city of Detroit. And Cranbrook. How I ended up there was sort of convoluted. This is where we start kind of going backwards a little bit. It's an incredibly beautiful campus. It's sort of has this heroic stance in the history of American craft and art and design. I, after going to undergrad, didn't know whether or not I wanted to keep pursuing advanced degrees in art. But at some point, I decided that I had to go back to school, and mostly it had to do with taking a trip to Finland in November, which looks something like this. The slide that I skipped over is maybe a little joke about minimalism and its appeal to sort of rationality. Because when I was deciding where I would go for my master's, the only way I could really decide was to factor every single discrete thing that would affect where I went to school, who I would be working with, how easy it would be to get there, whether or not I would need a car, how close it was to grocery stores, whether when I visited I thought I would make friends, how expensive the rent was, how nice the studios were, how many tools they had. There were a lot of other funny factors, some of which, I broke it down to every discrete possible little thing that would give me joy or irritation in the process of going to grad school. Some of the top things, of course, were cost, right? How was I going to pay for this? How much financial aid was I going to have access to? Right, so those were supposed to be really big factors. So I plugged it all into an Excel spreadsheet, which this is clearly not minimalist work. Plus there's like a dot right there, which I don't think anyone trying to make art would leave unless they were trying to really get you. So I plugged it all into an Excel spreadsheet, trying to be really rational about the decision. But I also knew what this would do is that when I programmed in when I gave each factor a rating, and I added those up, and the numbers told me where I should go, I knew I would try to, what is it called, juke the stats or something? Like I knew I would try to adjust things so that I could get the result that I wanted. And And so I think, in a way, a lot of the work that I make is a little bit trying to do this, trying to adjust minimal forms in a way that will have more sort of intimate implications. I think that the wisdom of your gut is equivalent to the wisdom of, days of calculations, but sometimes we need to double check. Okay, so before grad school, I worked in this industry, the gold industry, and in a lot of ways, it is why I ended up going back to school after several years of working for, in the fine jewelry field, and like a level of commerce that I never thought I would really work within. It was really quite enlightening and sort of gave me the push that I needed to go back to school. The one factor that I think I take away from that time, other than the fantastic mentors that I had during that time, and like building relationships with watchmakers and getting to talk to them about their cats and things like that, was that there are sort of these two assessments of value. I worked at a custom jeweler where people would both come in and ask that things be built for them that were one of a kind. And people would also come in with their old gold, and we would, weigh it out and then calculate how much we would be able to give them while still recouping a little bit of cost for ourselves by reselling the gold or reusing the gold. And so oftentimes what would happen is the same day that someone would come in and ask for something that would be one of a kind and that would take hundreds of hours to manufacture, the labor alone, somebody else would come in and want to sell and melt down these incredible pieces of craftsmanship, like these tiny platinum filigree rings that themselves probably took hundreds of hours to make. But the skill of the craftsman was no longer valued. Instead, the platinum had become valuable, more valuable to that person, or in this time. And so that idea of there being sort of a switch between what's more valuable, the labor or the material, is something that really stuck with me, and it'll come up again. I thought I'd share one piece from undergrad. It's a brooch in loop and loop chain, which is a particular technique where you're actually weaving gold and silver, in this case, together. And I turned all those tiny little plumb bobs. Okay. So, traveling backwards, I've been sort of warned before that one shouldn't involve the family in one's artistock. Because, I don't know, it's supposed to be all about the concept and the content and me and the stuff that I've made. But I wouldn't have even gotten to the point that I got in undergrad, where I decided to pursue metalsmithing as opposed to any number of other things that I tried, if not for the family. So quickly, I'm going to share with you guys a little bit about why I am who I am. Plus, I thought I was mostly going to be speaking to my students. So thanks to all of you who came out on week 10. Okay, so these are my parents. Like most of us, I learned everything of value from my mother. But everything I learned about making things with my hands, I learned from this guy, my dad, who is a true craftsman. I don't know that I would call myself a craftsperson. And I think that that's because the bar was set pretty high pretty early. So I am constantly astounded and humbled by the stuff that this guy can make. This is one table. It's an image that I have that happens to just, I think, be a really nice image because I am also incredibly fond of box forms. But this would be like, I don't know, 2.5 days or something. The amount that he is able to make and the quality that he is able to make it is incredible. So that's what I grew up with, and that heritage is pretty much why I ended up on this trajectory. A lot of it also has to do with my extended family. This is a partial group from my mother's side. I have like 50 first cousins, so it's a big family, and in any big family you sort of become like statistics, right? You know, because it's like when you have like 100 family members that you know by their first name, you can say like, well, you know, 3 of us are like this, and 5 of us are like this, but I think even still, we probably have a really high percentage, of artists in our family. So these are the people that identify as artists. And by identify as artists, I would say they actually make most of their living from being artists or craftsmen. So I guess I say this just for a little bit of context, because I don't, art and craft are the family business. So I didn't, when I was trying to be special, I was trying to do things other than art. Art feels like I'm in the family firm. So, which is both an incredible feeling and a complex one, as I'm sure those of you understand, that sort of like tension when you ultimately end up deciding to do what one of your parents does. They always knew that's how it would turn out. You tried real hard not to be them. But I don't think I really had a choice. Oh, this is my eighth grade project. And then I spent the next 6 years desperately trying to do anything but become a metalsmith. Okay, so let's get a little bit back into actual work. So I ended up being a metalsmith. It's spelled with a T, but I made this series of metals a couple of years ago for an auction piece. It was right around the time of the Olympics, and I just couldn't help myself. I mean, with sort of a standing interest in value and how that sort of creates a hierarchy. I mean, there's nothing more kind of a straightforward expression of that than, the gold, silver, and bronze. So these are all ingots. An ingot is when you melt down metal, either a pure metal or an alloy of 2 or more metals, and you pour it into a form. So I poured these ingots and then hand sawed them out. So the edge is really quite rough, like a coin. They are regulation scale, So Olympic metals have to be a certain thickness, a certain width, and then they have to be, the content of the metal has to be a particular ratio, and the gold medal has to be silver, plated with a certain thickness of 24 karat gold. So I followed all those regulations, but because they are handmade ingots, they have pits and scars, and they look pretty rough. Okay. So, getting back to, this sort of has to do a little bit with sort of why I made the choice to make incredibly rough metals, but it also will kind of carry through when I talk about sort of other themes that keep coming up for me, and that is this sort of like the quality of surface. These are patina samples, also made by my father. I would say that part of what he ends up working on a lot of the time is faux finishes, right? So making things look like things that they are not. And of course, that is just a super thrilling conversation to get into, is this idea of like sort of how to make one thing look like something that it's not. I love this idea of camouflage, and I also think that it's pretty easy to understand when something is masquerading, but there can be a lot of delight in the camouflage of things. It doesn't have to just be sort of this factor of dressing up lesser materials. This is my frame project. We did a frame project earlier in fall quarter in Thinking Through Craft, and so I dug this up. The frames I did not make in this series. I found them, but I love them because they themselves are fake. So the wooden frame on the right is carved to look like crinkled metal. The not wooden frame on the left is plastic covered in paper printed to look like wood grain. And then I found also a metal enameled frame that I don't have an image of, that was enameled to look like jade. And so I basically took these frames that were themselves so much about being fake and framed the actual material that they were trying to imitate. So I had gold-leafed brass in the crinkled metal frame, and a piece of veneer in the plastic wood faux bois frame. And then I had some jade, thinly sliced Northwest jade to look like this enameled frame just kind of extended into the real thing. But because of the function of the quality of glass, right, when we see things behind glass, it automatically makes something sort of more distant and less real. So, yeah, those are my frame projects. And another study sort of in this theme of surface and quality and value. This is a signboard that I think probably had a pretty hard life. It looks like it tipped over and then got scraped on the ground a lot. I took a picture. I mean, I know that on Instagram there's a lot of pictures like this, like, oh, look at this cool surface, this cool texture. But I think for me, it's not only that this signboard got totally roughed up in this beautiful pattern, but then the contrast of that against all of the sort of pink and black marble that's in the bus tunnels in Seattle. When I see things like this, I find them very thrilling. This is the side of a plane at the Museum of Flight. If you guys haven't been to the Museum of Flight, I highly recommend you go. I mean, I love rivets. So, there's lots of rivets to look at, but also I think when I'm starting to be more and more comfortable with the fact that I appreciate is the surface. So surface quality, so it's this sort of like watered look to the steel on the side of this plane. So I don't know how, yeah, it's coming out kind of clear. What I've started to do is when I find some amazing metal, just a piece of metal, a scrap that has really beautiful coloration on it, just from laying around. This piece of copper was underneath another piece of copper, and so it only started to oxidize along the edge. It's also sandblasted, so there's a quality of it being incredibly sparkly, and then kind of fading to this russet tone along the edge. So I've started scanning metal. We'll see where that goes. But I think this idea of sort of distancing myself from materials is helpful. It's interesting to me. I don't know that it's going to result in actual work, but for now, these are the things that I'm increasingly finding beautiful. I think one of the first pieces that I made where I was really, really interested in the quality of a deteriorated surface was when I made this brass box to replicate a cardboard box that I had found. The cardboard box was used to house like fancy dresses that had been dry cleaned. And I found it in a dumpster. The time that I found it, it was actually in relatively good shape. And the way that it was folded was incredibly beautiful. I've always had a love for sort of pieces that were folded in unusual ways. So I decided to replicate it exactly in a full sheet of brass. And then I used the brass box for a while. You'll see it come up in a couple pictures in the future. But ultimately, the most beautiful thing was the relationship between these two boxes as they began to age. Because, as you can imagine, brass ages differently than cardboard. And, so they became like these twins that initially very much mimicked each other and looked like, I got called out for, my sneaky Donald Judd prototypes. And then eventually they became something else. So I'm glad I didn't give up on them or throw them out. And the way that I sort of made them meaningful was that I allowed people to touch them, and I used them as boxes. So They can be displayed as sculpture, but they really are just boxes. And that's why they're deteriorating the way they are. And that's why I think they're becoming something more. These are some shots from the making process. It took 3 of us and a bending break to kind of get this sheet of metal to collapse in on itself in the same way as cardboard. Metal fights you back. It's one of the reasons why I love it. And that is an image below on the dolly of what they looked like when they were new. So they look kind of like these pats of butter. And then, of course, I mean, this happens to every artist. You end up seeing a lamp that looks exactly like the thing you just made. And then you think, okay, cool, someday I'll make it into a lamp. But they're so useful as boxes. Okay. All right, so I'm going to show you guys a little bit of work from when I was in grad school. But first, one last story about Julia growing up. This luggage set, this fabulous luggage set, I don't know if it was made by Skyway Luggage, but Skyway Luggage is a manufacturer of case goods in Seattle. And the house that my parents purchased when I was young had been built by a manager at Skyway Luggage. And instead of using wallpaper in the house, he took remnants of the vinyl material that they make the luggage out of and put it on the walls. But in a way that was so exquisitely beautiful, at each corner and each seam, the edge would be tucked under, and then with tacks of the exact same material be tacked all the way down the wall. I thought that this was amazing as a 7-year-old. And I think I remember my mother sort of talking about how it was like living in a suitcase, which it kind of was. I mean, literally, like living in a suitcase. But to me, that meant sort of adventure, right? Like living in a suitcase. And to her, it felt a little bit more like an institution. So eventually the walls were stripped of their vinyl, but that sort of level of care with a material that is sort of inherently so strange to be surrounded by, just carried right through, all the way into some of my grad work. So this piece was sort of a suggestive piece in the installation for my my final work at Cranbrook. I don't think I actually have it anymore, but it was made out of the same sort of vinyl material that they were covering all sorts of things with a couple of decades ago. This piece, although to me it was a little unsatisfying because it didn't have an actual function, it sort of implied function and the feeling that I wanted to have in that show, which was sort of these strange objects that had something to do with space travel. I thought of this as being sort of like a seat ripped out of the cockpit or something like that. I spent a lot of time early on being fascinated with forms that seem like they could fly. So these are some brass paper planes, some balloon forms, some pieces, so I was interested in making things that were lightweight, but then also wearable pieces that would be incredibly heavy and kind of weigh you down. And then the folding creeps in again. This is silver and leather. So this is what the box was originally intended for. I made the brass box, and once I realized that I had a surface upon which I could display materials or display objects, I realized that I could heat a metal box. I was trying to figure out a way that I could entice people to interact with objects. Coming from a jewelry background, but wanting to make objects, it's a tricky thing to try to convince people that they can come forward and pick up something that you've made. And it's something that I very much want. I want people to interact with the things that I've made. So how do you do that? How do you bring people to your work and sort of give them permission? One way is by making functional objects, or objects that are very clearly meant for use. I wanted to make things that were sort of exploring some more complex borders than that, things that are kind of ambiguous or even a little bit mundane, things that would be overlooked. And so I thought that if I could heat a box such that people would, when they pass by, feel the radiation coming off of it, they would immediately be sort of attracted and hold their hands out in the cold Michigan winter. So I thought if I can create this sort of like radiator and then, put things, it'll like get their hands really, really close. And then maybe that'll proceed to sort of picking things up. And it worked okay. Does anyone want to guess how I heated actually the inside of the box? No, not a tea kettle, but that would have been good. Moisture, that would have been a little bit of precipitation, but there's so many safety features on all of the new appliances that it was really tricky to find a way to safely, I didn't want to burn the building down. I didn't want to attend it. I didn't want to be in attendance of the piece constantly, because what would be the point, right? Then I would just sit there and see people walk by ignoring the piece. But what I ultimately ended up doing was buying a really huge electric blanket and folding it up and stuffing it underneath inside the box. That, you could feel it, but only if you got really, really close. So I would have liked to have increased the temperature a little bit more. But it was a fun project. It was on its way to something that I haven't quite resolved yet. And these are some close-up shots of pieces that I made to put on the box. So this folding and sort of coming together of shapes is something that has carried through a lot of my work as well. These pieces are cast iron, so also turning something very lightweight and paper into something heavy. This is that, you guys probably have it up in your booth, right? It's like, the sound dampening foam, and then little golden granules. I did a couple of projects, trying to mediate this, I want to make an object, I want to make a piece that you can touch, that you can put on your body. How do I sort of mediate the experience and also give sort of a surprise moment? So this is a piece of glass. It's a found a found object. I guess it would be a candy dish that I mirrored and then made sort of a clasp for the back that magnetized it so that I could position magnetic, like hematite beads in the grid so that you could kind of peel away this necklace from the wall. And that was kind of based a little bit on this other piece that I had been working on earlier that was it was too complex. The string that was necessary for sort of allowing the necklace to come together had to be woven into all these holes underneath this piece of plexi. So again, Museum of Flight plug. A lot of my fascination with this idea of sort of objects that mediate our experience or objects that improve our experience or allow us to live or live better kind of came out of this idea that materials can be used in surprising ways to, sort of enhance our day-to-day experience. This is a cross-section of an early plane. I think it's the part on the back that helps you steer. It's corrugated aluminum and wood. So it's incredibly lightweight, but the corrugation gives it strength. So this idea of sort of using materials to allow you to fly was incredibly enticing to me. And then it also, in my mind, had somewhat to do with survival. So this guy with his survival blanket looking really cozy. This idea that an incredibly thin material can help you survive. And then, of course, the only Barbie I was allowed to have was astronaut Barbie. So the work in my grad show ended up having a lot to do with that. So these are some of the pieces that I made that year. Sort of like strapping things. This was the ultimate installation. So you can see there was that necklace that pulls away from the wall there. These pieces, which some of my students have seen, are the blue ones, are shades that I made out of niobium and then colored with electricity and put some sort of like celestial markings all over them. That process is something that I really love because there is no physical color with the metal, so it's not like a dye process. It's not like anodizing aluminum. I'm sure a lot of you have seen those like colorful aluminum tumblers. That itself is actually a dye process, whereas anodizing titanium and niobium can be done just with electricity. So it's something that I actually, at a certain point in grad school, I decided that I had to figure out how to make an anodizing rectifier of my own. So now I can, and I occasionally teach how to make battery-operated titanium coloring units. It's pretty fun. The electricity goes through the metal and creates pores in the surface. According to the depth of the pore, the light refraction as it goes in and then out determines the color. So as you set the voltage affects the depth and therefore the color of the metal. These are some more pieces from the grad show. So, it's not clearly about space travel, but this idea that these pieces could be sort of fallen off of a ship or pieces and parts. Like I'm always thinking, I'm thinking in pieces and parts because I guess I want people to be able to sort of build something else with their eyes. This piece, I weighted it so that it floated. This is brass that I folded and soldered and then was plated in gold. This is silver. This is lead. And this piece, which is actually a neck piece, the two parts come together and click together with magnets, is covered in vermiculite and mesh. And those two delightful objects are airline food containers. So kind of pulling from sort of the most boring part of flying and trying to remake it into something that is both sort of itself very ordinary and also completely odd. Okay, so a lot of what I'm thinking about when I'm choosing objects or trying to make objects, I think, ultimately has to do with sort of an obsession with boredom or things that are repetitive and things that you would overlook or not notice. I think that a lot of art is trying to make things that are saying something very specific or extraordinary. And I'm increasingly wanting to sort of, very much make things that are beautiful or interesting or evocative. But I also just want to make things that would be completely overlooked. And I think that comes from my relationship with boredom and also my relationship with making things over and over and over and over again, which creates this state of boredom, which I find actually incredibly productive. So after grad school, I was experiencing a lot of boredom. You have such a rush and you do all these things. It's the same sort of experience as, now trying to manage any big feat. You get ready. There's a lot of adrenaline. And then afterwards, you're left with sort of doldrums. But I think the doldrums are one of the most productive parts of the cycle. But the opposite of boredom is, of course, fear. I know there's a couple of people that haunt regretsy. So this little pendant, which I think is made out of a Scrabble tile, is for those of you that like regretsy. I wonder if Eleanor Roosevelt would appreciate that pendant. So this idea of boring being ordinary, boring being typical, boring being repetitive, repetition, I think is repetition and the type of boredom that repetition creates, I think is, at least for me, a very fertile time for my brain. Tedious, mundane. A bored dome is when everything starts to look like Buckminster Fuller. Okay, so This idea of sort of monotony and routine and ritual was very much on my mind once I exited school. And I was asking myself questions like, how do I work? Where do I work? How do I make? What do I make? And how does that create a life? Some of the other pieces that I made in that time during grad school had to do with tools that you would strap to your body. This is an image of Armstrong, I believe, wearing mirrors that they strapped to their suits. So see, he has 3 mirrors, one on his chest and one on each arm. And those mirrors are, the point of those mirrors is to allow him to see all the switches behind him in the module, because otherwise he wouldn't know which switch he was switching, because the space was so small he couldn't turn around. So this idea of tools that sort of enhance the ability of your body was something I was kind of already thinking about. And then I especially started thinking about them right after I graduated, because that was when Fitbits started getting really popular and really accessible. The reason why the Fitbit struck me as being so interesting actually had, though, to do with the fact that I was doing a lot of repetitive manufacturing. And I wasn't able to find the best image, really, but this strap that's down on the wrist of the person wearing sort of like a lab coat is, I believe, sort of an equivalent to the Fitbit in a production manufacturing situation. So manufacturers will put equipment on the people who are making whatever they're making in a production line in order to see how efficient that person is performing. It gives, live data on like how many times they're moving or putting something together. And I would think about that a lot. I think both because my background's in jewelry, and so I always am thinking about what is on the body and why, but also because I was doing a lot of things again and again and again and again, such as I make drawer pulls. I also, for a while, worked in a ceramics factory. So I was trimming pots. I can't remember how many I was supposed to do in a day. Like 150, I think, or something like that. And I was the slowest one. There's something really enchanting, though, about, at the end of the day, seeing 150 pots all lined up. And that, that sort of sight of sort of individual discrete objects, parts, being all organized together and sort of extending into the distance is something that I still watch out for. Does anybody know what these are? So when you see them, you'll go, ew. They're ring holders. Thanks for that. Yeah, they're diamond-shaped ring holders, which I then arranged to look like plugs. All right, so we'll wrap up with a couple of projects that I've done recently. One that was a direct sort of result of me being so fascinated with boredom was this project. So this is another artist, Timothy Firth, who's really big in the Seattle art community, especially recently for sort of establishing artist workspace, which is increasingly hard to come by affordably in Seattle. But for this project, we were paired together in these windows in Capitol Hill for several weeks. Timothy was doing sort of an ad hoc live broadcast. So he would have people actually come in when he was there and sort of talk to him about random subject matter. So he was sort of about the collection of stories and the collection of information through his project. And on my side, I was sort of about the consumption of information, because what I had decided to do, and this is sort of a project that in of itself, part of the point is that it can never be finished, but what I had decided to do was to watch all of the TED Talks that had ever been produced, while knotting pearls by hand. So putting a tiny knot in between each pearl, which the people that can actually do this well, of which I knew one incredible pearl knotter when I worked in the fine jewelry industry. They can do it incredibly fast. It's like they're just throwing a tiny little ball back and forth. It happens that quickly. I have to do it much more methodically with like sort of a needle and tying each knot and doing it while trying to watch TED Talks. There sort of became this struggle because I was trying to pay attention to what I was doing, but I was also trying to pay attention to the TED Talk. If the TED Talk was too interesting, I wouldn't knot as many pearls. I kept track by burning a pearl of when each talk ended. And of course, they're all different lengths, but it was sort of my method of counting. And also, not unironically, sort of playing on this idea of pearls of wisdom. I think TED Talks, although they're very entertaining, they feel sometimes like that advice that you really need at that one particular moment. And of course, since then, and actually when I was doing this, I was finding all sorts of interesting critiques on the TED Talks. So this project is continuing ad infinitum. I will basically never finish this because this was all happening in of the dates. Oh, so the total running time of the talks when I started this project was 2 solid weeks, 336 hours, and that was in December 2013. So I will never catch up, which I think is something that is actually really, pretty funny. But this also very directly came out of the fact that I was noticing that a lot of my friends, and occasionally myself, would actually try to make art in front of watching shows, which to me felt very strange that we would be doing that. There I am trying to explain why I'm doing this. So I got about 40 hours in, and then I've done a little bit since then. But that's what I've done. Maybe 12% of what existed in 2013 of the watching, and not all of them are as good as others. A more recent project that sort of was exploring some of these same ideas was getting a copper rod the same size as a penny and slicing it, so sort of like cutting my own pennies. Okay, so there's a couple of things that are my sort of exits from boredom. When I'm sitting there and I'm getting really bored because of all the repetition, I start having a lot of ideas. And so eventually I sort of need to work them out. And the primary way that I do that is through material experimentation. So these are some things that I've experimented with over the years. This is plasticine that then I covered in aluminum. Inside-out paint tubes. A box made out of mylar. These are balloons that were covered in silver and then silver clay and then baked. Paper, trying to get paper to float on an extension. Trying to get granules of gold to float on top of oil. Trying to make a coffee bladder look like a life preserver. Some sort of experiments with copper, trying to make sort of these corrugated surfaces, boxes that can drown themselves. Lincoln Log toothpicks. And then drawing with, this is a piece, I'm trying to draw by almost 3D printing by hand. So this is aggregate in acrylic that I'm sort of building up these walls, sort of layer by layer. And sometimes these experiments, so this is me experimenting with, by copper electroforming a, like a hot pad. And sometimes the experiments do end up resulting in completed work. And occasionally they do not. This piece, which is this mesh, itself is sort of more of an experiment than a piece, but ultimately it ended up inspiring me to create this piece, which I made maybe 2 years ago now, which is a silver net that I showed at Soil the same month that Shah Osha had a show at Soil as well. You can see her orchids in the background. Do you see them there? So this whole process of making this net was also sort of a practice in doing something incredibly repetitive. So I took this pile of short sections of silver and then fused the end. So each node is the end of 4 fused sections of silver. Okay. So I'll admit that sometimes I get bored with my own work, and sometimes I get bored with the art world, not in an altogether unproductive way. If you guys don't know about this site, Who Wore It Better, you should definitely check it out. It's where they will compare 2 artists that are doing incredibly similar things. So it's sort of like this combination of, gleeful kind of, I'm going to mispronounce a German word here now, Schadenfreude, like when you're like, ha, 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 it happened to you too. But I think also it's something that I've become increasingly okay with because, we're all sort of walking backwards and repeating things that have already happened. And so one way that I kind of kick if I feel like I'm not seeing what I wish I was seeing is through creating shows. I initially started out doing this, where and when I could. This is a container, shipping container that a friend and I rented for an exhibition in Toronto. So we had a shipping container, sort of some industrial lighting and some cardboard. And we put together this exhibition that was happening during a conference that was happening there. And again, it's always good to be able to explain somewhat what it is that you're doing to people that don't believe you. So, increasingly, you have to find a space, if this is something that you want to do, you have to find spaces where people will let you kind of put together shows of things that you really believe in. And so much space is unavailable. I really want, I would love this to be a gallery and for the name to stay the same. So eventually I joined Soil, and through them I did some, so I joined in 2013, and I did some publications on newsprint with them, which is an incredibly fun process. This was the sort of centerfold of one of the publications. It says, please place your nose here and close your eyes. And it's because I wanted people to smell the newsprint. I like the smell of newsprint. Okay, so these are the last two things that I've done recently. One is a show that recently happened this January at Soil called Stratum. I came up with this idea 2 years ago and proposed it kind of as a joke. I do not suggest that you propose anything as a joke, because then someone will make you do it. So the theory was that all members, of which there are about 20, would get the entire gallery, but simultaneously. And in order to do this, they would have to only have 6 inches around the gallery. So this is the beginning of that show, which I facilitated along with the help of all of the Soil members. It really was their show. I kind of orchestrated and designed the postcard and then kind of pushed everybody off the ledge, and they went willingly. So we marked out 6-inch sections, and then people started installing. And this video is by another member, Morgan Kahn. So within their 6 inches, they could do pretty much whatever they wanted. It became also sort of an exercise in collaboration and sometimes mediation. This is getting pretty close to the end. And then here we are. Of course, everybody's installing the last night. And then I come in and clean up. And part of Soil is that you sit 1 day a month. And so this is the time when you're sitting. And then all of a sudden, because it's opening night, a bunch of people show up. So that show was incredibly rewarding. I mean, it was sort of, it presented a lot of uncertainty for a lot of the members, because they sort of didn't know who they were going to be next to. They didn't know what anybody else was going to be doing. But it ended up being a really joyful experience. And even though I would have to say that this sort of maximalism, where all the walls are completely covered, was sort of chaotic, it got a lot of really positive response. People really enjoyed having so much to look at. Okay. And last, this is a show that I did in September with Natalie Jenkins called Lunch. Again, in my sort of desire or my attempt to create spaces and objects or sort of invite people to make objects that can be touched, we created a space in the gallery that we wanted to feel sort of like a public space or a park where everything could be handled, everything could be touched or sat on. These are some pieces made out of sort of stripped sheetrock wallpaper sections from Natalie's home that she made. We created a space in the back out of plinths. So all the plinths in the gallery we turned into benches. And then we asked soil members to bring in dishes so that if people wanted to come in and actually eat lunch, they would be able to eat with a real set of dishes. Part of the reason we did this show, why the idea came to us, is because we wanted the actual community space to function for soil members. So we have bi-weekly meetings. So to have a space that was sort of integrated into the show where people could come and sit, and that the gallery would sort of offer things to you. So we cut out a wall and turned it into a shelf, and then we would sort of refresh sort of vegetables or peanut butter and jelly sandwiches or things that people come in, visitors to the gallery or members would have something that they could eat while they were there. And then playing with this idea of sort of permanent art, I made some bronze fruit. And the bronze fruit was displayed alongside, Natalie made some incredibly wonderful hammer tone paint dipped real fruit. So the bronze painted fruit and the bronze fruit existed sort of side by side in these installations. And over the month, the bronze painted fruit began to get soft or shrink or rot. And so, there's sort of this distinguishing that happened between the two pieces, the two types of fruit. We were really interested in how this sort of related to this project by Mark Dion, installing these bronze fruits in a park that ended up getting sort of stolen and vandalized. There's sort of some more thoughts behind that, but not the time. This was a piece that I made, the concrete piece in the foreground, a pond to have in the gallery. Somebody came in on opening night with rain boots and stood in the pond. This is a piece by Nadej Rasko-Romjan. She made a coat for more than one person called Group Hug. So it had 7 arms. So people would come into the gallery and find their arms, have a group hug. The one piece that was not able to be touched was this piece made by Heidi Schweigler, made from a chair. So this was the one piece in the entire gallery that was not allowed to be touched, which I think was like this perfect counterpoint to the fact that absolutely everything else in the gallery was able to be interacted with. We have really, really strongly encoded awarenesses of what we're supposed to do with certain objects. This piece by Courtney Kemp, the tiles she hand cast out of silicone. She wanted it to feel kind of like a pool or like a powder room with like really out-of-date colored tile, but then also like a stage. And on the opening night, a dancer came in and totally uncoerced at all of her own free will, used it exactly for what it was meant for. Okay, and that's that's pretty much towards the end, other than I have a few pictures of the work that's at Staples Base, but we're getting up on the one, not Staples Base, that was another show, at Feast Art Center in Tacoma. If you guys have time to come to the closing this Friday from 7 to 9, you would all be very welcome. These are just some quick shots of the stuff that's there. All right. So I successfully ran your time down to ask me questions. So now the scariest part of the Evergreen lecture has been diminished. That's all.